Welcome back to part 3 of our notes on histology. In this section, we'll focus on introduction to muscle tissue and nerve tissue um, for us. So, muscle and nerve tissue, kind of a general overview. We're going to get more in depth into how muscle tissue does the functions it does and how nervous tissue is able to do the functions it does in the unit on muscles and the unit on nervous system. There's just a lot of depth we can go into here. So here we're just going to cover the general overview of what they look like, how to identify them, their basic functions, and move on. So not get too deep into it because we will get much deeper in future units. So let's begin. So the objectives: know the basic functions of the three muscle types and nerve cells in general, and be able to identify the three main muscle types under the microscope. I'm not going to have you identify nervous tissue under the scope because I just don't have any good slides of nervous tissue for us to use in lab. And if we're virtual, I could maybe do it, but we're just going to stick to, let's hope we can do it in person in a little bit. Muscle functions, one job, contract. That is their main job. Muscle has other functions we'll get into in the muscular unit, but its main job is contraction. Okay. Types, three main types: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Let's start with skeletal muscle. Control. Okay. Skeletal muscle is controlled voluntarily. All right. That means you can say, ooh, I want to bend my pointer finger. Hey, I did it. I had voluntary control over that. It just doesn't happen without my conscious effort as a general rule, unless you're sleepwalking or something. But you have voluntary control over skeletal muscle movement. Its function is to pull on bone, like my biceps pulling on my ulna there to cause that motion, or skin, like that, to create gross body movements. Hopefully, it wasn't too gross. I mean, gross is in large body movements that you can see easily. And how do we ID them? These are a couple of the key factors, and we'll look at them in the picture in the next one, but they're pretty long, they're cylindrical, they have many nuclei, and they have striations or stripes going perpendicular to the length of the cell itself. So let's take a look at that here in this. So we can see skeletal muscles here. And I've tried to, I'm going to pull this out of the way and down here, outline the outer edge of one of these cells. None of the cells in this picture are complete cells. They're all cut off here and here because these muscle cells are super long. Okay, so I kind of outlined the outer edge of one cell here and I extended it out on both ends, and probably not far enough, to be honest with you. But just to give you the idea that they are long. These little purple things, those are not the cells. Those are not like muscle producing cells like we saw with chondroblasts or fibroblasts where they secrete an extracellular matrix. Those are the nuclei of this cell. The cell is this huge, big thing. And the reason these cells, these nuclei all look like they're stuck out on the outside is because we just packed the middle with actin and myosin proteins. Just packed it in there. So all the nuclei and other organelles are squished up around the outer edge. Now we can't see the ones on the top or the bottom because of the focus issues with the microscope, but we can see them on the outer edge. So we can see these nuclei here. The reason, well, let me ask you, why do you think there are so many nuclei in a muscle cell? I'll give you a hint. Muscle cells, like we said, are packed with huge amounts of the proteins actin and myosin. Well, you're correct if you answered that, excuse me, in that sense, the nucleus holds the DNA, and the DNA contains the codes for making proteins, which then sends that code out to the ribosome to make the proteins. Muscle cells are producing so much protein compared to their volume that they need a lot of copies of that master code for making those proteins. Okay, one single strand of DNA is not going to be able to provide enough protein making instructions for all the ribosomes and all the protein it needs to make. So you got lots of nuclei scattered throughout this cell. So that's why they're multinucleate. They're really long. And we can see these striations in here. Those striations are formed by the precise alignment of the actin and myosin filaments in the muscle cell. There are areas where the actin and the myosin overlap and areas where they don't overlap over here. And that gives you the dark and the light bands that you're seeing here. And the precision is so amazing that we can actually see it under the microscope. This is caused by a molecular overlap. That's cool. Molecular overlap is causing that striation effect there because it's so precise and it's so cool. All right, cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, it's involuntary. You do not have control over the contractions of your heart muscle. Can you indirectly control the speed of your beat? Indirectly, yes. You can calm down, you can breathe slower, you can exercise a lot to get it to go up, but you can't just sit there and say, okay, beat slower, be faster, be slower. You can't do it. It is involuntary. You do not have conscious control over it. Okay, its location in the heart, as the name cardiac implies, and its job is to contract to pump blood around your body. Interesting thing, there are gap junctions in here that help it with the transmission of the electrical impulses that cause that contraction to happen in a sequential manner so that it contracts, certain parts contract before others in your heart. We'll talk about that when we get to the cardiovascular system itself. As far as IDing it, let the thing get out of the way, it does have striations like skeletal muscle, but only one nucleus. The cells themselves are not quite as insanely long as they were in cardiac muscles. It only needs one nucleus, and it's a bit bigger generally. Um, the cells themselves are often branching. They're not just one long cell like we saw with the skeletal muscle. They can branch off into different directions because the heart muscle isn't pulling in one direction like skeletal muscle pulls things together. Heart needs to squish and squeeze. So the muscle fibers kind of go off in multiple directions, kind of fitting together like interlocking fingers, which we'll see in the next image. So we can see the heart here. There's one nucleus. You can see it's bigger. You can see the striations pretty clearly. Here I've outlined one cell that clearly shows the split appearance of this one. Here we're not seeing that, right? Another cool thing is the ends where they attach are called, I think it's labeled up here, yeah, intercalated discs. This is where those gap junctions are I was talking about. So the cells butt into each other, lots of gap junctions there, and allows communication directly between the cells. So that's another characteristic you're looking for. So if you see striations, you're dealing with either cardiac or skeletal muscle. And the ways to tell them apart, skeletal muscle's got many nuclei, cardiac has one. Skeletal muscles are long and straight. Cardiac muscles are going to be a little more irregular, and some of them are going to be branched. And cardiac muscles also have these intercalated discs, these thicker chunks where the two cells meet that skeletal muscle does not have. All right, smooth muscle, involuntary. And you find these in the walls of hollow organs. So your esophagus, your stomach, your bladders, your intestines, all those hollow organs that need to, your arteries that need to move materials through those hollow areas are going to be surrounded with smooth muscle. You do not have control over when your intestines decide to move food from the duodenum to the jejunum. Okay? It just happens when the food's ready to get moved to the next spot. So it's involuntary control. And their job is to constrict and squeeze and push the substance through. Kind of like when you're trying to squeeze a tube of toothpaste to push the toothpaste. So you grab the bottom, put your fingers around it, and kind of squeeze up to kind of push the toothpaste out the top. That's what smooth muscle does. And it's a slower, more rhythmic contraction. It's not this fast, quick, skeletal or cardiac contraction. It's a let's push it along. It's the tortoise, right? Slow and steady wins the race kind of a thing. As far as ID go, they're generally smaller cells. They only have one nucleus. They are not striated, and they're kind of pointed at each end. I kind of think of them looking like kayaks. Okay, so here I have a bunch of them. You don't see the striations, and I've outlined one of them. There's the cell, and then the nucleus in the middle looks like the cockpit in a kayak. So we've got something that looks like kayaks. That is smooth muscle. And you can see it lining all these hollow organs. All right, quick quiz. Take a look at this one. What type of muscle do you think it is? This was cardiac muscle. We can see it's got some branching features. It is striated, so it's either cardiac or skeletal, but it's got some branches. It's got the intercalated discs right here, and just one bigger nuclei per cell. All right, well, let's quiz you on the next one. What type of muscle do you think this is? Yep, that is skeletal muscle, a longitudinal section. So we're taking a section lengthwise with the directions of the fibers. We can see that it's clearly striated. We can see that they're long, unbranching cells, and that we have multiple nuclei per cell, and they're generally pushed to the outer edge here and here. All right, how about this one? Okay, that one was a little tougher, wasn't it? This one here, let's take a look at it before I show you the answer. So they look round. They almost look like fat cells, right? They got a nucleus pushed off to the side, kind of almost empty looking in the middle. But here's the key. We can see in some of these that, like this one here, 1, 2 nuclei in this cell. All right. 1, 2 nuclei in this cell. So it's multinucleate, which means it is skeletal muscle again, but in cross section. Rather than going with the fibers, we're cutting across the fibers. So we can't see the striations because we're not looking at it from the right angle. But the cells are pretty big. Nuclei are relatively small, and the nuclei are all pushed to the outside, and we have multiple nuclei. So that is skeletal muscle, just a different view. What do you think this one is? Yep, that's smooth. Much smaller cells. Nucleus is comparatively large compared to the rest of the cell, and they're kind of shaped a little bit like kayaks, kind of tapered on both ends. So here's nervous tissue. We find it all over the body. Its function is to receive input and conduct output. So bringing signals in, so senses, like your senses like sight, vision, taste, all those things, but also temperature, pressure, the amount of calcium in the blood, the amount of protein in the stomach, all those kind of things. Okay, we talked about with negative feedback loops. Some of them are hormonal, but a lot of them are nervous based. You got to have these sensors both inside and outside the body to detect these things. All right, they are. Here's some a property of them is that they have irritability and conductivity. Irritability means, if you were sitting in class, I'd poke at one of you until you reacted, but if I did this to you, eventually you would get irritated with me and slap my hand away, right? You'd respond to the stimulus. Response, stimulus. That's irritability. Nerve cells have the ability to respond to an outside stimuli. So if they get squished or they get hot or they get photons of light hitting them in the rods and cones in the eye, they will then generate an electrical signal, conductivity, to send that message on to the next nerve or the muscle or whatever it is it hooked up to. As far as ID goes, some of them can be incredibly long and thin, like up to 3 feet. The sciatic nerve from the base of your back down your leg, 3 feet long. And they're often sheathed in protective cells called myelin, which we'll come back to. We're going to worry about that more when we get to the nervous system itself. And here's just a picture of one. You can see there's the cell body with the nucleus, and then it's got all these long projections out called axons and dendrites. We'll learn more about those later. You don't need to know that now. They help carry that signal elsewhere in the body. Just some examples of what some look like. We can see the myelin sheath around this one right here. These extra cells that are kind of protective. Just a different look at what another one might look like. And that'll do it for our section on muscles and nerve tissue. Our last section will be on body membranes, and I'll see you back here in a little bit to talk about that. Catch you on the flip side.